too. Of course, we'll come back to that. Michael Taylor, how did these ideas trickle down to the ordinary man in the street? I mean, in 1854, the Crystal Palace moves to Sydenham and they construct dinosaurs in the garden. It's a huge attraction, but what do people mostly think about these dinosaurs? Do they think of them as a contradiction to the Bible?
It's a very important question because it's always possible to fall in to just treating this thing as an intellectual parlor game happening in learned societies and Oxford colleges. But there is from the 1830s this gradual development of the popular culture of science. First, actually, through the pseudoscience of phrenology, which is something that the average man or woman can practice if they have a book as a guide and a pair of calipers. Phrenology being the apparent ability to deduce somebody's moral character and faculties from the size and shape of their skull. So, whenever the dinosaurs appear at the Crystal Palace, they become one of the great attractions of that second palace. Harriet Martineau records listening to people looking at them in awe and wonder, and they are this wonderful thing. But they don't necessarily understand all of the implications of them because they say, these creatures drowned because they were too big to fit onto the ark.
So they've just fitted them into a creationist story of the world, or a biblical story.
Well, it's not necessarily fitting them into a creationist story. I think that demonstrates that not everybody, the average person in Britain in the 1850s, hasn't yet been affected by intellectual debate. But what dinosaurs do, first at the Crystal Palace and then in visual culture elsewhere, so from 1870, whenever the Education Act means that many more children, many more people are beginning to read, there are popular science books in which dinosaurs play a really key part. So they are fascinating to them in the 1870s and 1880s as they were to me in the 1990s as a child. And it's by that gradual process of their increasing presence in popular culture that they acclimatize a growing number of people to the evidence and to the ideas which inform paleontology and eventually ideas of natural selection.
And it's very clear by the end of the 19th century we are in a completely different place culturally. Darwin is buried in Westminster Abbey. Darwin, who'd been terrified of the implications of his own theory. We have Charles Bradlaugh, the first avowedly atheist MD, is finally sworn into Parliament. It takes some time, doesn't it?
It is. There are, because this is not a war with definitive battles, because it is this tussle over many decades between competing views of the world. There isn't a defined moment at which you can say X won or Y lost. But I argue that in the early 1880s there are these 3 or 4 moments which indicate that a scientific way of looking at the world, that science, if we can call it one thing, as a font of intellectual, political, and even moral authority in some ways, has established a permanent presence for itself in public discourse, is evidenced first by Huxley's foundation of the Royal College of Science, in opposition actually to Richard Owen's Natural History Museum, which he regards as being a monument in the Palean tradition. The election and the re-election of Bradlaugh, the prominent atheist, refused to take the oath which is necessary in order to be admitted to the Houses of Parliament.
Because it was a religious oath.
And he's imprisoned because he refuses to leave the chamber having not taken the oath. But the electors of Northampton re-elect him at 4 or 5 successive by-elections. And then, as you say, Darwin, who feared for a long time that he would be regarded as the devil's chaplain for promulgating his dangerous ideas, is buried a couple of feet from James Ussher.
Nick Spencer, you begin your comment by making the point that all of these questions, the origins, the universe, the origin of man, those battlegrounds of the 19th century should be replaced with a new question, which is, what is the nature of man? Or that's where we've moved to.
It's partly that. Actually, it's a slightly stronger claim, which is that a lot of the apparent battlegrounds of history, so around cosmology and so on and so forth, were actually more profoundly battlegrounds about human nature. So, if you go back to Copernicus, nobody in the 16th century had their faith challenged by the decentering of the Earth and the cosmos. It just wasn't an issue. What was more important was the centrality of human, and time again, those interesting points of friction and tension between science and religion have revolved around the question of how do we understand human nature. Now, the previous book I wrote ends up basically in the 21st century, but finished that, it occurred to me, actually, that's going to become a huge issue in the 21st century, because our capacity to understand, to see, to modify, to quote-unquote improve the human is going to be enormous in the coming decades.
You say nobody was threatened by a Copernican view of the universe, but there were battles fought in it. Certainly, what would you say to an atheist scientist who says, well, you've just retreated to the last redoubt because the other fortifications have fallen? You know, there was a battle for authority over the origin of the world, and that has been lost by religion to a certain extent.
Well, okay, lots of things going on in that question. I mean, Copernicus, under no circumstances, thought that his theory was a threat to Catholic or Orthodoxy, nor did Kepler or Brahe. Even Galileo was a profoundly committed and serious Catholic. What they did do was, in different ways, question certain sources of intellectual authority and political authority as well. It was as much at that time to do with the dethroning of Aristotle as the premier scientist of the medieval world, and the replacement with, well, to Greek, Descartes or what, mechanistic philosophy. So it wasn't a straightforward kind of religion explained thing and science explained thing, not least because science, or experimental natural philosophy as it was called in the 17th century, was born of and protected by many theological presuppositions and commitments.
So what do you mean by what it is to be human, which is, as it were, the kind of field in which, in fact, scientists and the religious can have fruitful discussions?
Well, the philosopher Wittgenstein had this phrase about seeing as. You don't just see, you see as. You see the world as something. And it is impossible to look at human beings without seeing them as something. You can see us as evolved primates. You can see us as genes. You can see us as information. You can see us as social creatures. You can see us as spiritual creatures. One of the arguments is the book, tension tends to arise when we reduce that vision. So it's the only legitimate vision. So we are only primates, or we are only spiritual beings. The theme that runs through Playing God is that we should try and resist that attempt to collapse our understanding of humans into a singular vision, and in particular into a single literalist, positivist language, and that it is quite possible to understand human beings as material beings, as information, as social beings, and as spiritual beings.
You're essentially arguing we don't carve up the territory, we share it. I mean, you take issue with Stephen Jay Gould's notion of non-overlapping magisterium, by which he means we're going to have authority here and we will say what goes there. You can have that area over there, you can have morality, that's all.
I mean, that was a brave and courageous and well-meaning attempt to try and bring a cease to the Darwin Wars of the late 90s, when Gould first suggested the idea that science is about facts, religion is about values, and never the twain shall meet. Well, it's just a bit too neat. I mean, there's something in there, but he carries it far too far. I advocate, or Hannah and I advocate in the book, what we call partially overlapping magisteria. Science and religion are distinct, they are different, they're not doing the same thing, but they're not so distinct as to never overlap. And they particularly overlap again when it comes to this question of how do I understand and what values do I attach? I'll pick you up on the word evangelical there. So at first, studies tended to show there was a correlation between being anti-vaxxer and being religious, and they were fine being anti-vaxxer and being Christian, and then it's being anti-vaxxer and being a fundamentalist. But actually, the strongest correlation there is between being an anti-vaxxer and having a certain view of the state, which is rooted in your beliefs, in your faith, in your theology. And in particular, there are two kind of strong correlations. So one is between being anti-vaxxer and being Christian libertarian. They're people who, very prominent in the US, who believe that the state should basically back out. And then there's another correlation between being an anti-vaxxer and what you might call being a Christian nationalist. which paradoxically is right at the other end of the spectrum, which says, I have a high view of the state. The state is failing to carry out God's mandate, and therefore it should be judged and kept out of this particular sphere. Interestingly, it's not specific on only a US experience, it's quite an issue in some Orthodox countries as well. It's a peripheral issue. We're talking about 10% perhaps, but of course when you're dealing with mass vaccination campaigns, 10% matters.
Okay. What is political theology, and how is it going to save the world?
That was a provocative chapter title.
Well, you provoked me.
So good. So the argument there is that they are Christian libertarianism and Christian nationalism are unjustifiable political theologies. Political theology is effectively how do we live together? What are our political values? In particular, what is the function of the state in the light of your particular faith? Lots of different faiths. Now, there's a huge hundreds of years of reflection on the function of the state, but the key core argument there is that it's perfectly within the state's right, indeed duty, to protect citizens in the way that it did do.
We are still facing a question of authority of last resort here, aren't we?
How do you mean?
Well, I mean that when the argument gets difficult, a religious person is going to sort of say, well, this is what we should do because God. Whereas a scientist may well say, no, this is what we should do because of these facts about how vaccines work.
Well, if I could push back on that, I think it's a bit of a caricature of religious reasoning. Interestingly, every single argument like that ends up with what we call basic beliefs or core principles that you can't justify it because of, I suppose you can't go all the way down to a kind of a positivist bedrock which says, therefore this must happen. I mean, Bertrand Russell tried to reduce science to maths and maths to logic at the beginning of the 20th century, and he failed. And it's even harder to try and put ethics on top of that particular tower. So ultimately, all our arguments draw from worldviews which are, in speak, underdetermined by the available evidence.
Francis Winter, I just want to bring you on this. You were talking before about how important it is to take into account patients' religious beliefs, but do you have a problem, as it were, sort of religious pushback?
It was very interesting. I actually worked in a mass vaccination centre during the pandemic, and did sometimes speak to people who had been told by their faith leaders that they should not be vaccinated. And often the faith leaders were working from what they had learned from various incorrect information that was being circulated on social media and so on. So they were telling people that they shouldn't have the vaccine because the vaccines were made from the cells of aborted fetuses and so on. And so having a conversation with them, explaining, particularly with the mRNA vaccines, that of course they were entirely synthetic. There was no material from aborted fetuses in them at all, and just contradicting this misinformation that they'd been given fortunately meant that we were able to persuade some people that the right thing to do was to get vaccinated. Of course we couldn't persuade everybody, and we engaged other faith leaders to work with us to continue those conversations. But what was very helpful was when people like the Pope came out and said, no, I've been vaccinated, and people should be vaccinated because that's how we protect other people in society.
Nick Spencer, you make this point in your chapter. In fact, it's a positive correlation between many faiths and the vaccination rates.
Yeah, absolutely, and that includes Christianity. I mean, it's important to recognise within that particular debate that's happening in 2020 that all the main church leaders, and indeed leading evangelicals and the leading fundamentalists in the US, said, yes, we're getting vaccinated, you should get vaccinated. It is talking about a peripheral issue here, but the problem with vaccination campaigns is the peripheral issues impact on everybody else.
You also have a chapter obviously addressed to abortion, because that is another hot button issue, it is a lot of confrontation. There is no single religious position on this. There is not a single religious approach to it.
No, that's right, yeah. I mean, it's often the case that those views that are most absolute get most oxygen, but nonetheless, I think it's fair to say there is a spectrum of views, and there are a spectrum of different justifications for these views, which is one of the things we go into in the chapter.
Michael Taylor, you wanted to
I did, not to return this to the early 19th century, but I think there's a striking parallel to be drawn, or maybe it's a continuation. about debates over playing God, because in the sphere of economics, this is a real problem in the early 19th century. My first book was about the abolition of slavery, and lots of the evangelicals were also evangelical communists who believed that Adam Smith's invisible hand was actually the hand of the Lord, placing each man in the station to which he was entitled to be. And that was why slavery was so offensive, because it inhibited a person from reaching the position to which he was entitled. So it's the interposition of the state in the early 19th century which attracts these accusations of playing God, and perhaps some notorious because it's Nadir during the Irish famine, where there's an adherence to laissez-faire principles, not just because of belief in the economics, but also the belief that it's the Lord's hand moving things and placing people in the station where they should be.
Inexpensively, it takes us back to your title, Playing God. I mean, the classic use of that phrase is a rebuke to science, isn't it? It's a rebuke to science going too far and straying into realms which, as a religious person might think is unfit.
It is, and that's one of the reasons why we emphasise right up front the whole point of choosing the title of the book was that it doesn't have validity. It's not in the way it's popularly used in this debate. When we're looking at humans are a God-playing species, that's what we're here to do.
Yes, but how do you get around that? I mean, how do you decide what kind of God you're going to play, as it were?
Metaphysical beliefs and ethical reflection. That's precisely the point. The point of subverting that particular command that you shouldn't play God is, okay, we have, through cognitive abilities, through imaginative abilities, through social and communicative abilities, an unprecedented ability to modify the creation around us. The question is, to what ends? What vision are we inspired by to do that? Now, God is obviously the theological way of putting that, but you can easily translate it into slightly more kind of public reasons. What goods are you, final goods are you trying to achieve?
This is exactly where you work, isn't it, Francis Flinter? You work on one of the front lines where ethics and science meet, which is clinical genetics and more specifically pre-implementation genetic diagnosis. Can you just explain what that is?
So pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. Yes, so couples who know that they are at significant risk of having a child with a serious disease may be very keen to avoid having an affected child who they may well then see die, but may also feel that becoming pregnant, having prenatal diagnosis and having to consider termination of pregnancy is something that they could not contemplate. They would not, under any circumstances, want to consider an abortion. And so another option that is available to them, and of course only some people will choose to do this, is to have fertility treatment, even though they're often not infertile, so that embryos can be created in the laboratory and tested when they're just a few days old, with a view to selecting embryos that are unaffected to be placed in the womb, so that if the woman becomes pregnant, she knows right from the start of her pregnancy that the pregnancy should be unaffected. And for some people that is a preferable alternative. In fact, for them it may be the only option that they would consider in their attempts to try and have a healthy child.
It took some time for this procedure to be authorised by the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority. What were the anxieties? Because, as it were, we knew we could do it before we did it. What were the anxieties that delayed its implementation?
I think anything to do with embryos is always contentious. Some people would argue that pre-implantation genetic testing is simply a very much earlier form of prenatal diagnosis than having a test done at 12 weeks or 16 weeks. And there are certainly some people, and some of them do have very strong religious beliefs sometimes, who feel that it would be morally unacceptable to terminate a pregnancy, but they do feel comfortable with the concept of selecting an embryo that they will know should be unaffected. Of course, there are some people for whom even pre-implantation genetic testing is not an option that they would consider. It was interesting, there was a consultation done jointly between the Human Genetics Commission and the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority that asked members of the public what they thought about pre-implantation genetic testing, and I think the response from the public was a very mature one, in that overall people were broadly accepting of it as a treatment that could be offered, but there were some people who said, well, I don't think I would ever want to have it myself, but I accept that it could be a useful option for other people. And so that was a very interesting acknowledgement that people are different and they will make different decisions. It's very very tightly regulated by the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority. And in order for a disease to be approved, it has to be reviewed by the committee, and a licence is issued on a disease-by-disease basis. And there is a list on the HFEA website of the conditions for which pre-implantation genetic testing can be offered. But even then, not every couple who is at risk of having a child with that condition will choose to have PGT for all sorts of reasons.
Is there a slippery slope, in your view, between saying we don't want our child to have a life-threatening illness or even a 50-50 chance of a life-threatening illness, and saying, well, actually we'd like our child to have these qualities, because that's obviously a possibility when selecting an embryo,
Well,
and genetic testing?
I mean, you can have the theoretical discussion about embryo enhancement. First of all, I would say scientifically it's not possible. We don't know enough about how to...
Genes aren't a recipe.
That's right. And I don't think it is something that most of us feel we would even want to consider, because any time you start to introduce a new test, you've got to remember that there are also risks. It's one thing taking a risk if you're trying to treat or cure a condition or help a couple avoid a serious disease. I think it's a very different thing if you're contemplating taking a significant risk for no very good reason.
I wanted to talk about mitochondrial implantation, because that's a further degree, isn't it?
So mitochondrial replacement technologies, MRT, this is a very new treatment which is only available in this country in Newcastle. And it's offered to women who carry a disorder in their mitochondrial DNA. Now, the mitochondrial DNA is different from the nuclear DNA. The nuclear DNA is what we inherit 50% each from our mother and father, and it's in the nucleus, and it determines how tall we are and what colour our eyes are, and so on. The mitochondria are different. They're little organelles in the cytoplasm of the cell, so not in the nucleus, and they're sometimes described as batteries, but that's a bit of an oversimplification, because they both make as well as store and release the energy that the cell uses. And if your mitochondria don't work properly, then the rest of you doesn't work properly, particularly the organs that need a little energy, like the brain and the heart and the liver and the kidneys and so on. We all get all our mitochondria just from our mother. It's the only thing that doesn't follow the normal Mendelian patterns of inheritance. And so if a woman has a very large amount of abnormal mitochondrial DNA, she's at risk that all her children will inherit that and could be very sick and may well not survive. And there is a way of treating this by replacing the mother's faulty mitochondria with mitochondria that have come from the egg of the mother, as being an egg donor. So the child that is conceived still has their mother and their father's nuclear DNA and looks like their mother and father, but the mitochondria that they have that generate the energy that the cells in their body need have come from an egg donor. Now, I know sometimes people use this incredibly unhelpful phrase, three-parent family, which I think is very, very misleading and very unhelpful. But the reason that phrase has come about is because the mitochondria in the cell have come from an egg donor.
And does that involve different ethical questions than the kind of previous procedures we were talking about, or it's just it's a further extension that you have to consider?
I think the ethical principles that need to be considered are the same. What are the chances that this will work? What are the risks? And are we sure that the couple that are going through this treatment, and also the egg donor, fully understand what is being done, why it is being done, what the treatment will involve, and so on? Because only then can they make an informed decision as to whether or not to go ahead.
I assume, except in oblique ways, that religious authority doesn't play a part in the deliberations that you make about medical practice, or does it?
I think it depends on the couple involved and the extent to which
I mean, at the level of bioethics.
The knowledge and guidance and advice that can come from religious leaders can be very helpful.
Do you have religious members?
We do. The HFEA has a religious member, a former bishop, on its panel.
As it were, sort of specified that there will always be religious members?
Often, yes, and often research ethics committees in hospitals will have a chaplain on the committee who can bring a very important perspective, because they're used to thinking about difficult decisions.
Inexpensive.
I think in these issues we're talking about ethical arguments. And ethical arguments draw on a wide range of considerations. There are going to be lots of empirical considerations coming in there. but they're going to be value considerations as well, and human values draw on our deepest commitment to what things are, how we understand and frame the universe, and the value we accord to various different life, human life, non-human life, and so on and so forth. Now, there is I think it's incumbent on everyone who participates in this discussion to draw on what John Rawls called public reasoning, to use ethical arguments that are as comprehensible as possible to as many people as possible. But I think also Rawls singly failed to convince many people that there is such a thing as public reasoning that will convince all the people all the time. And sometimes you do draw on your deepest held personal metaphysical commitments, even if other people don't share it.
Yes, it did sound though for a moment there as if you were arguing for a kind of secular ethics.
I'm very happy with the form of secularism. The way it evolved in the 19th century, it became, for good reason, an anti-Christian movement. But the phrase secularism has its origins in Christian theology in the 3rd and 4th century. It's dealing with the politics and ethics of this age. And as far as public reasoning is a secular form of reasoning, I'm very happy with that.
Michael Taylor.
George Holyoake was effectively the founder of secularism in the 1840s and 1850s. He's a person who was imprisoned for railing against religion and the impiety of priests. But whenever he then finds a number of publications, whenever he articulates a view of secularism, he is very clear that it is a form of ethics, it's a form of moral crusade. He just wants to strip any kind of biblical dicta from it.
I mean, your book includes the moment at which the word secularist is invented.
Yeah, that is in the early 1850s. That is precisely the moment. And then in the 1860s, you have Huxley and his allies in the X Club, called the X Club because they couldn't think of a better name, who want to create a scientific profession which again can operate and can pursue ideas and can investigate without worrying about the strictures of religious dogma or about religious criticism.
Huxley was famously belligerent, I mean, Darwin's bulldog. Do you think we have moved on from that kind of antagonism? We're in a better place. We're in Nick's kind of realm where we can have overlapping conversations.
Well, I think so. Huxley was famously belligerent, but most of his ire was directed at Richard Owen, who probably deserved it.
Famous, yes.
And I think in what Huxley actually doesn't say, certainly later in life, he displays a more moderate tone. He coins the term agnostic as a means of demonstrating that he's actually not certain about it. It literally means against a certain knowing. And whenever he's redeveloping the curriculum for London schools in the 1870s, he doesn't chuck out theology and religious studies completely. He recognises that there is potentially a moral value. He uses a phrase quite similar to, let's not chuck the baby out with the bathwater.
Yes, and it's worth saying that Huxley's last writings on religion are actually very, very positive. He couldn't stand theology. Theology really dropped his goat, but religion, which was a much more moral and aesthetic concept for him, he was very positive about.
Yes, I'm reminded of the story that Richard Holmes tells in his book The Age of Wonder, where I think it's William Ewell, the British Association for the Advancement of Science, meets in 1834, and they're trying to come up with a term for this new thing they are. And William Ewell suggests scientist, and then somebody says, well, it sounds a bit like atheist. We better avoid that. And obviously it stuck.
And that was the reason that the term secularist took off, and that Holyoake and Harriet Martineau were so fond of it, because they knew that what they were doing in some way could be described as atheist, but the word atheist was very, very dangerous.
Well, we are beyond those hostilities now, I think. Thank you to all of my guests, Professor Francis Flinter, the clinical geneticist and member of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, Michael Taylor's Impossible Monsters, Dinosaurs, Darwin and the War Between Science and Religion, and Nick Spencer's play God, co-authored with Hannah Waite, are both out now. Many thanks to today's studio engineer, Sue Mayo. Next week, Kirsty Walk on music. For now, thank you and goodbye.
Tom Sutcliffe, the producer, was Katie Hickman.
On BBC Radio 4, American music would be impossible without black culture, and every period in its life was original.
The composer John Adams, the novelist Zadie Smith, and the sculptor Anthony Gormley.
This made me realise that actually this darkness was actually a place of power, of extreme freedom.
just some of my guests who will be revealing the influences and experiences that inspired their creativity in the new series of This Cultural Life with me, John Wilson, starting at its brand new time on Thursday morning at 11 on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds.
The daily service is just starting now on Radio 4 Extra, 9:45 every weekday morning. But now a new series on Radio 4, Cafe Hope. Rachel Burden celebrates the people making our communities better places.
Welcome to Cafe Hope, a diner with a difference. This is a place where people open up about the amazing things they've done to help change the lives of those around them. These aren't the headline grabbers. These are people like you and me, and we want to celebrate their stories, especially at a time when a lot of the news we're hearing can make us feel hopeless. Our cafe is a reminder that just one person can make a huge difference. The people who haven't just talked about doing something, they've actually got up off the sofa and done it. And it doesn't always go to plan. We want to hear about the hurdles along the way, not just what you're doing, but how and why. So I've just swept the floor, sorted out the specials board, and I'm ready to open. Hi, Steph.
Hello, Rachel.
Morning. Do you want to leave your bike around the back there?
Yeah, okay. I've just looked it up. It's good to go.
Now, Steph Jones goes everywhere by bike, which is understandable, because he's the founder of this amazing organisation called XO Bikes. More on that in just a moment. Right, come in, sit down, put your feet up. I know battling through the traffic can be a bit of a nightmare. While I put the kettle on, tell us a bit more about your story, because I know a lot of us get to midlife and feel there might be something missing, something we have to change. Now, you didn't go out and buy a flash car.
Wish I had.
What happened to you?
I wasn't as happy as I thought I should be. And I looked at my life and I had an amazing wife, great kids, thriving business, plenty of friends. I really couldn't want for anything, and yet I thought there must be more to it than this. So I started sort of having a look around and thinking, what is it that I'm missing? And a succession of blind alleys, but I ended up sitting next to a couple that I'd known at university at dinner tables, and we'd end up getting a bit sort of drunk, and I knew they were Christians, and I go, come on, what is it, this Christian nonsense? What's that all about? And I was sort of being fobbed off, but something kept me going, well, kept sitting next to them at dinner, and in the end, I became a Christian aged 50, which I didn't see coming, and had quite a sort of dramatic impact where I think up until that point I'd been the centre of my life, and then I wasn't, and that was what sort of when things really started to change. Long story short, I started going to a church in Clapham, and I'd never thought about prisons or prisoners. I'd never really thought about anyone except myself, really, and just about my family. But the local chaplain in Brixton Prison had cancer, and our church were invited to go in and help out on a Sunday morning, give the guys a service, because they weren't getting one. But, you know, I was new, I didn't know the Bible. What can I add? I can make teas and coffees or whatever. And at the moment I stepped into the prison, I just felt this sort of big finger prod me on the shoulder and go, you're staying here. And at that point, I had my ad agency, and I spent about a year volunteering on a Sunday, and then I started doing business mentoring for the young men. And that's when I started to see prisoners who'd been released. I'd wake them off. They were coming back. I said, well, how do you live that? You weren't coming back. You believed it, I believed it. And generally, it was because they couldn't get a job. And I thought, okay, no one else is going to do a job, I'm going to do a job. But I didn't have jobs to give them, so I then realised that's what we're supposed to do, is lead, create businesses to train and employ prison leaders.
So where did the idea of XO Bikes come from, specifically?
That was on a golf course.
All the best ideas come there.
I was playing with a mate and I was telling him what we were trying to do and exploring different ideas for different businesses. And he said, what about electric bikes? It's too complicated. I've heard that the police, the Met Police, have got thousands of bikes in storage and they're rusted. Why don't I go and ask them if we can have some of them, and we can start a bike recycling business. And through that we can train prison leavers and turn them into mechanics. And the other side of that is I knew that back in COVID time, cycling was booming and there was a shortage of mechanics, and there still is. And so I thought, okay, so this is a viable career for them. It's a business that's only going to get bigger, it's bike maintenance, better paid as bikes get more complicated. there's so many facets to it, there's different types of cycling. And my brand background, I thought we could create our own brand here and do something really cool, which is hopefully what we've set up. We had to do it as a charity, and that's called Onwards and Upwards. And what Onwards and Upwards does, its purpose is to break the cycle of reoffending. You know, my product is not bike, it's a bloke that doesn't go back to prison. But actually when you break it down, we take a bike with a past and a bloke with a past, and hopefully you, the consumer, give them a decent future.
You make it sound so easy though, Steph, but having that idea on the golf course, some sense that there are some old bikes somewhere that need doing up, and getting that to a point where you're bringing prisoners through, teaching them the skills, making it viable, that is a huge task to actually realise.
Do you know what, Rachel? I keep being told that, and this isn't false modesty. I think this is mission work. The guys in prisons are at the bottom, and that's where a lot of great mission work happens. We're not a Christian organisation. I'm a Christian. You don't have to be a Christian to work with us and help us or anything, but that's what's driving me. I don't think I'd have had the ideas without the faith. I don't think I'd have had the gumption to do it. I certainly wouldn't have had the energy to keep going with the determination. We've attracted incredible people, volunteers, funders, just everyone sort of coming out for us.
There must have been moments though, or maybe there weren't, where you thought, oh, I've come across something here that I can't quite manage, or do you feel let down by anyone at any stage?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I know what we've done and what we've achieved with the bikes that the Met have given us. I know they've got a lot more, and I want all of them. But at the same time, I know what a complicated beast the Met and the Mayor's office and that whole machine is. They know, and as well as me, this makes total sense. You've got the police, whose job it is to reduce crime. Here we are, committed to reducing crime. You've got bikes that are the proceeds of crime. They're taking up all the space in the yards, and they're rusting, and some will get auctioned for a bit of money, but they don't get much. The others will go to landfill.